Okay, this afternoon we're going to be talking about personal change, and I entitled it Stuck in the Rut because most of us at some point in our life have been stuck in a rut, something we wanted to change, and yet it was hard to actually see the change take place. Anyways, just a few illustrations derived from cartoons. I saw one, somebody sent me a picture of Confucius. It says, Confucius say, don't worry about the past, you can't change it. Don't worry about the future, you can't predict it. And don't worry about the present, because I didn't get you one. And also another cartoon I'm not able to show here, but it shows a whole flock of birds just suspended in space beside a large telephone pole. And one bird is saying to the other, this wireless technology really scares me. Another picture I saw, there's a picture from 1990 and a very thin man and a very fat TV. Then it shows 2011, and the man has gotten considerably thicker and the TV has gotten considerably thinner. So that's an example of change. Marcus Aurelius says the whole universe is change, and one of the little phrases I like, it says change is inevitable except from a vending machine. Anyway, but there are challenges with personal change. If there's something in your life you're trying to change, there are reasons why it's difficult. 88% of all resolutions, this is like New Year's resolutions, actually end in failure. And actually, if somebody is trying to get you to change, that actually makes change even harder. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's the case, why somebody who's trying to change you will actually make things more difficult for you. We'll also talk about why effort sometimes backfires. If you try really hard to accomplish something, just the very effort you put into it sometimes backfires and makes it more likely that you'll be stuck. And then some things are wired in. You can't change everything. There's a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon I like, and some of you are familiar with Calvin and Hobbes, little boy and his pet toy tiger that actually becomes real on occasions. Anyway, Hobbes is saying to Calvin, Calvin is saying, I like homework. Homework makes me happy. I don't want to go outside. I want to do math problems. Blah. My brain always rejects attitude transplants. So I think we can all relate to that. Anyway, let me just tell you a little bit about why effort sometimes backfires. The first one is what we call the Romeo and Juliet effect, which basically means that if somebody is trying to change your behavior or your relationship with somebody, it actually makes you more likely to do whatever it is they're trying to change. For example, parents who do not like the person that their son or daughter is dating. So the parents insist you must break up with that person. I don't like them, they live in their car, they don't have a job, whatever all else. And as soon as the parents say that, that actually enhances the feeling of love and adoration on the part of the person, of the young person. There's also the white bear story. Now, I've always heard it with pink elephant, don't think of the pink elephant, but the actual original research was done with the instructions, don't think of the white bear. And what they discovered is the more you try not to think about a white bear, the more you think about a white bear. So just the very act of trying not to do something actually often backfires and makes you do more of it. Then there's the whole thing about reactance, and this is what I mentioned when I talked about how someone wanting you to change can work against you. They actually did some brain scan studies where they had somebody imagine, or actually several people imagine somebody who wanted to change them. They also were asked to imagine somebody who just wanted them to have fun. What they discovered is when you think about somebody who wants to change you, your brain actually starts shutting down. When you think about somebody who wants you to have fun, your brain actually opens up and expands, and it's actually even more, it makes it more possible for you to create changes. So a basic point is that reactance is real, that when somebody is trying to change you, your brain actually literally starts shutting down. We also know it's a bigger problem with men than with women. So it's one reason why I tell women, if something you're doing is not changing your husband, give up, because his male brain is going into a major state of reactance and is shutting down all of your good instructions. We also know, just the brain research on scarcity and deprivation, that when your brain is feeling deprived, it's likely to react to deprivation by binging. We mentioned that with money, if somebody says you cannot spend any money, you are more likely to actually binge spend. Go out and spend a whole lot of money. So when your brain is feeling deprived, You know, you go the other direction. When you're telling yourself, I can't eat that, I can't have that, I can't do that, your brain starts to cry out, you know, says, I want it. So scarcity in general, that's one reason why even sales sometimes talk about the fact only a few left. If you go online looking for something to buy, sometimes a little picture will come up or wording will come up saying only 3 left. And this is actually designed to snare you in, because if you believe that something is scarce, you actually want it more. Misdirected energy actually wears you out and leaves you more vulnerable to the problems you're trying to change. Now, sometimes when you're trying really hard to change something, and once again, we can do brain scans, watch this happen, all that energy that's kind of floating around in your brain, it actually wears out your brain, and you finally get so exhausted, you sort of collapse and you end up doing whatever it was you were trying not to do. So it just shows you some of the problems with conventional effort. Now, I also want to mention some reasons it can be hard to let go of things that you want to change in your life. One of them is just the whole issue of self-medication. A lot of times, the difficult things in our lives, things we want to stop doing, the bad habits we want to break, they actually serve a purpose. At least temporarily, we feel less depressed, less anxious, you know, something. Just temporarily, we kind of feel good, and it's kind of what we call self-medication. We often get into bad habits because we're bored. We want life to have meaning, and sometimes even the pursuit of something we ought not to pursue gives life meaning and helps break the boredom. Sometimes just to escape from pain. You know, ordinary real life seems dull, boring, but especially painful at times. You know, you're facing a lot of pressure, you know, you've got those bills to pay, something is kind of eating at you, and you know, just being able to escape from the pain actually feels good for a while. Social context. You know, a lot of behavior is influenced by social context. For example, classes where I talk about affairs, we discover that there's a very strong link. If people in your social network are having affairs, you are more likely to do the same thing. And that's true pretty much across the board. The research does show that if people you hang out with are doing something, it makes it a whole lot easier for you to do it. Sometimes bad habits or problematic behaviors are designed to change the relationship with difficult people or life situations. I've worked with several situations where a child was acting up in school. And one of the reasons that this became so pervasive is the child discovered, now when I act up, mom and dad kind of pull together as a team. You know, when I'm doing fine, then mom and dad just ignore me. When I act up, when I'm in trouble in school, mom and dad start getting along better with each other, they start paying attention to me. And hey, this is a no-lose situation, so what's wrong with having a little bit of problem in school? Now sometimes it's just reworking things from the past. We do know that the brain kind of gets into a groove, and we often go back and repeat patterns from the past, and sometimes we think them through, act them through, with the idea we'll do it better this time. For one woman, she told me, she said, I've married the same man 3 times. He had a different name, different birthday, different social security number, but he was the same man as my alcoholic, abusive father. So once again, you just see how that thing gets going, where you have this idea, if I keep doing the same thing again and again, eventually it will work out well. Trouble is, it usually doesn't. But another thing I tell people is a lot of times, like resolutions or things we decide to change, it's actually because of crazy messages from society. An example I give has to do with both Barbie and G.I. Joe. Now, we all know that Barbie is pretty unrealistic. She looks like she's about to topple over at any minute. But somebody actually did a computer analysis on a Barbie doll and said that if she were real, she'd be 6 feet 9 inches tall with a 20-inch waist and a 40-inch bust. And no literal, real-life human female could ever actually look like that. And so, do you really want Barbie as your role model? See, a lot of times people try to emulate, you know, things like Barbie or those airbrush models you see on TV. But it's not just women. This is actually a problem for men too. You know, back when I was a kid, we had G.I. Joe. We didn't call G.I. Joe a doll. You know, G.I. Joe was an action figure, not a doll. But if they did the same computer analysis on G.I. Joe, the original G.I. Joe would have been about 5'10", you know, kind of average height, would have had about a 44-inch chest, which is, you know, that's fairly buff, but still within the realm of possibility. Well, a few years ago, G.I. Joe went through a transformation, and the new G.I. Joe would have a 56-inch chest if he was 5'10", and 27-inch biceps. That's twice as big of bicep as the old G.I. Joe. And the fact is, there is no way in the world somebody could look like that without steroids. So once again, just be aware of how often we try to do something to conform to some societal image, which is actually just a little bit crazy. Dr. Hernandez talked yesterday about romance. You know, people all over the world are emulating American viewpoints on romance. Once again, a pretty unrealistic picture of what romance is all about. I like this quotation from Jonathan Haidt. He says, "Epiphanies can be life-altering, but most fade in days or weeks. The writer can't decide to change and then order the elephant to go along with the program. Lasting change can come only by retraining the elephant, and that's what's hard to do." Now, let me explain what he means when he talks about the elephant. This is an analogy I'll use again. He says that all of our behavior is actually driven by our emotional, affective, what he calls it, the elephant. Then he talks about the writer, which is the rational, logical self. And he says we have this idea that our rational self is driving the elephant. But he says actually it's the elephant that's in charge. And he talks about the process of what we call confabulation, which means, you know, the brain scan research shows that you already know you're going to do something before your rational brain knows it. And then afterwards, your rational brain confabulates to make up why you were doing it. Now, that does not mean your rational brain has nothing to do with change. We'll talk about how it works. But ultimately, the rational brain can't just tell the elephant what to do. The rational brain has to change the elephant over time so the elephant wants to do something different. Now, that's the crucial part of all of this, is that if you're trying to do something you don't want to do, ultimately the elephant will win. So you've got to train the elephant to want the things you want the elephant to want. If the elephant wants one thing and the rider wants another thing, as Jonathan Haidt points out, the elephant always wins. Been there, done that. You all know how that works. Anyway, one of the things I want to start with is just talk about changes that are a natural fit. Because there are some things that are pretty much wired in, some things about us. Basic temperament, for example. You can't totally change your temperament and become somebody totally different because you decided you didn't like the old self. And the next few items are pretty much, you know, extensions of that. They talk about, these are temperamental items, like introversion or extroversion. Now, some people are kind of more in the middle, and they can be one way in one circumstance and another way in a different circumstance. But we do know that some people are energized by people. You know, you go out in a crowd, you go to a party, you mingle with people, and wow, that feels good. You feel energized by it. Now, there's other people. They may love people, but they still, if they go to a big party or a big crowd or something like that, they're exhausted afterwards. And they might be saying, honey, can we go home? And it's not because they don't like the people there, but it's because they gain energy from the times when they regroup. And that's pretty strongly wired in. As I say, some of you may be in the middle. But if you're way over on one side or the other, you know, that's not something you can just suddenly wake up some morning and saying, I'm going to condition myself to be different. You know, that's wired in kind of stuff. Competitiveness and thrill seeking. You know, there's some people who are always worried about, are they going to win? They're always keeping score. They're always comparing how they did with everybody else. And if you've ever played a game with somebody like that, you know how easily they get into an argument. You know, if they're arguing over the rules, that's not fair. I should have won that. You didn't, you know, that something, playing miniature golf or golf, you know, whatever it is, you know those people. They're always arguing about it. Those are the competitive types. Thrill seekers are similar, and they can be the same people, but thrill seekers are the adrenaline junkies. Now, one of the examples I can think of this is the race car driver from a number of years ago, Richard Petty. They discovered that his physiological system was amazingly well wired for racing, because he could be racing at 200 miles, or however fast those things go, and his heart rate hadn't gone up a bit. And so there are some people who are just wired differently, and they can handle very highly stressful situations and do really well with it. And some people are bored unless there's always some excitement going on. My old rock climbing buddy was like this, and we used to have a lot of fun early on in our rock climbing days. But he was a type T personality, a thrill seeker. And pretty soon it got to the point that he just wasn't happy unless we were living that close to death at every minute. And I still remember hanging by my fingernails up there on a cliff face, and I was thinking, you know, I'm not having fun anymore. And he was. But he was a type T, a thrill seeker. Once again, that's pretty strongly wired in. And some of the rest of us, you know, we might like some adventure, but we don't need to live on that edge of adrenaline all the time. And some people are quite the opposite. They need things very stable, very peaceful, and they do a lot better under that way. Desire for change versus preference for continuity. Now this is one where my wife and I are very different. I like things to stay, you know, continuity. I could live in the same house forever. You know, I could stay in the same job long term. You know, for her, 2 or 3 years into a job, she's getting restless and bored. You know, we've just finished redecorating our house now, and she's already talking about when can we move to a new one. And I'm just saying, no, I want to stay here the rest of my life. You know, so that's probably pretty much wired in. You know, head on the clouds versus feet on the ground. You know, some people are more abstract. They tend to think about ideas, the future, that type of thing. Other people tend to think more in terms of concrete realities. I work a lot with the dental students. Now, the dental students tend to be pretty concrete. You don't want a dentist kind of zzz while their mind is just floating off in some philosophical sphere up there. You know, you want somebody who's pretty good at the, you know, being grounded in the real world. Living for the moment and impulsiveness versus compulsivity and future direction. You know, there's some people when they go on a vacation, they want every single thing all mapped out. So other people are going on a trip, you know, they'll just say, oh, we'll kind of go with the flow. Wherever we stop, that's where we stop, and, you know, we'll get there eventually. Worry and fearfulness, you know, this also tends to be wired in. You can find this even as early as a day old. Some kids just, you know, you can tell that they have more of a fear response, a startle response. So you can sometimes see some changes in some of these, but these tend to be pretty strongly wired in. And I tell people, you got to respect who you are. It's just like I mentioned yesterday, when we talk about marriage counseling. One of my big mantras is I don't do personality transplants. And that's partly what I tell spouses, but it's also what each one of us can tell ourselves, that there are some ranges of possibility, but we can't be just anything you want. This quote by Tim Kreider I like. It says, you learn that your personality has a certain shape with definite inflexible bounds. Bounds you find out about because you keep bonking into them head first when you try to change. We are not indefinitely malleable, like it or not. You are a certain kind of person. So I just tell people, you gotta respect that in yourself, in your spouse, in your kids. You know, some of the old parenting books made it sound like your child was this just lump of clay that you could mold into young Mozart if you just condition your child right. But then you, you learn, children have minds of their own and personalities. You can work with that, but you gotta respect it. So just a few things to keep in mind about respecting the person you are. I mean, the first thing is to find people who balance you. When I'm teaching business classes, I talk about the fact that if you're the detail person, the exacting, you know, task-oriented person, maybe you need to get somebody else in the office who's more relational and cheerful and outgoing and can help with some of the human dynamics of the class or of the workplace, because it's not something that will necessarily fit you. On the other hand, if you're very, you know, spontaneous, very relational, very connected with people, you know, you probably need somebody in your life somewhere to take care of the detail work, because they don't tend to go together. You can also develop the bright side and reduce the dark side of different traits, because all of our traits have both dark sides and bright sides. I mean, the same things that are negative in one context are positive in another. And as I say, playfulness, spontaneity. Somebody may complain about that. You're not responsible enough. But in other contexts, you realize how that's a good thing. You know, you want people who are playful, who are fun. Same way with, you know, somebody who's very organized and controlled. So look at the bright side of the traits, and, you know, what can you do to highlight the good parts of different things. You can also find life settings that take advantage of who you are. Now, this is one I've had to think about since I've gone into full-time academics. Now, I love to teach. You know, teaching is a lot of fun for me. I hate to grade papers, and I hate all the detail work of academics. And I've discovered that that's one of the real challenges I'm dealing with, is that, you know, that the classroom part I love. But as I say, I've had to really struggle to, to work out the other part. And that's one thing I really enjoyed about pastoral ministry, which I did for many years, is that it just offered a lot of opportunity for continuity in relationships. And so, something I still miss about it. Sometimes you can develop accountability systems to manage the excess. Now, for some of you, managing the excess might mean something where you tend to kind of go out of control or do too much of some things, but some of you, the excess might mean that you're too responsible. So if any of you are too responsible, you may have to have somebody be accountable to help you not be so responsible. I remember with my daughter, my kids are very different in temperament. And my son, was the kind who was always kind of pushing the envelope and, was easy, kind of got himself into some challenges at times, very much a free thinker. My daughter was one of these super conscientious types that you just kind of looked at her funny and she would, oh, did I do something wrong? Somebody asked me once, well, how did you punish your daughter? I was trying to think about it. Well, I remember she did slam the door once. But, she was just always so conscientious. And I still remember when she was in high school, one of the things we were encouraging her to do is just let loose, have some fun. Don't be so responsible all the time. I mean, she's, as I say, just really hard worker. She's a PhD student at Yale right now. And, so she's really, done the responsible thing. So sometimes getting somebody to hold you responsible means hold you responsible for not being so responsible. Anyway, as I've said before, there are no personality transplants. So you respect who you are. But now I want to talk a little bit about what I call the natural energy principle, which basically means that there are ways to create personal change that actually work. And within the limits of who you are, you're not going to be somebody totally different, but you can actually make some changes that help you achieve the goals you have, maybe overcome a bad habit, achieve something you're working on. One of my illustrations here is what I call let the tide float the boat. If you just imagine, if the boat is at a certain level and the tide is lifting the boat, it's easy. But if you imagine yourself standing on the bottom of the bay holding up the boat, it would be hard. So I just ask people, now do you feel like the tide is lifting the boat for whatever it is you want to change, or are you standing there on the bottom of the bay holding up the boat with no water doing the trick? If it's feeling too tiring, and you're getting burned out, worn out because of what you're doing, then you know right away the tide is not floating the boat. So the big task there is not to figure out how to hold the boat up, it's how to get the tide to rise. So you need to figure out where to direct your energy so it actually lifts the boat by a natural principle so the tide rises. Now here's just some changes that some of the neuroscience people have identified, some brain changers. Meditation. We can actually see over time when people practice various kinds of meditation that it does tend to show up as changes in the brain. Spiritual and devotional practices. People who have an active spiritual, devotional life, your regular practice of devotional life can create changes in your brain within as little as 11 weeks, things you can actually measure. Now, one thing I might mention on that is just even your view of God is crucial here. If you have a positive view of God, we can actually see it in terms of positive brain growth. If you have a negative, vindictive, fearful view of God, it actually damages an area of your brain called the anterior cingulate, which has to do with flexibility, with love and relationships. A whole variety of different things are affected by that. But the kind of God you focus on, the picture you have of God actually influences that. We do know also that regular practices of gratitude, just reminding yourself of what you're thankful for, that actually causes changes in your brain. Actually changes something we call your set point. Because you all have a set point for happiness or unhappiness. Some of you are just grumpy by nature. No, grumpy by nature. But we discover that if something really great happens to you within a year, you're pretty much back to your set point. If something really bad happens to you within a year, you're pretty much back to your set point. There's a few exceptions, like having a child die will change that. But most things, like if you won a fabulous amount of money within a year, you'd be back to your old set point. We even know people who are in accidents end up paraplegic. In a year, they're back to their set point. But gratitude, regular practices of gratitude, including, might even be a job you don't like or a spouse you're arguing with. But if you remind yourself what you're actually grateful for, your brain begins to change as a result. Now, I'm sure most of you know about cognitive therapy. It's just basically retraining the way you think, so you don't maybe necessarily catastrophize things, for example. Something that may be a small thing, but in your mind it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Like you have a new car and you get a little scratch on it. You know how your brain starts, that scratch starts growing and growing and growing, and by the time after the end of the day you go back out to the parking lot, you're sure that that scratch that you saw in the morning has turned into, you expect the whole side of your car to be dented in. But cognitive therapy is just basically mental retraining, so you learn how to talk back to yourself, and those irrational thoughts that your brain starts throwing at you, you learn to fight back. That's the essence of it. Good relationships, we talked about that yesterday. Nature, art, music, laughter, all of these positive experiences change the brain. And there are times when medication is important. People who have just ongoing patterns of, say, negative thinking and none of the conventional therapy or cognitive kind of work or any of this other stuff really makes significant difference. I do believe there are times when people have ongoing basic neurobiological deficits. Certain neurotransmitters are in short supply. We have no problem with diabetes or something, saying that there are sometimes people who need insulin. But sometimes people put a lot more stigma if somebody has an ongoing struggle with some aspect of the brain. And we just say, well, you should tough it out. I mean, one example is attention deficit disorder. Now, I think sometimes kids get overprescribed just because they're energetic. But there are some children for whom it really makes a night and day difference, because there is actually something in the brain that has to do with attention deficit. It's an actual brain wiring issue. And there are times, attention deficit kids are often very creative, spontaneous, fun. But certain tasks are nearly impossible. And the more you yell at the kid, just try harder. That actually, the research shows that shuts the brain down. So what most parents do with attention deficit kids, and what most spouses do with attention deficit spouses, makes things worse. Negative fuel, one that you learn about with problem areas in life, there's probably something that is fueling it. We get fires up in the neighborhood where we live periodically, and one of the big tasks that they prescribe is that we're supposed to spend some time early in the fire season clearing all the brush. Because the idea is if you clear the brush, at least you removed a lot of the fuel. And we had a fire here a few nights ago. My wife woke me up in the middle of the night. We saw this bright orange glow on the horizon. We were hoping it wasn't like the one about 6 years ago that actually burned off 60% of our backyard. And that got us really diligent about brush clearance. It was kind of funny because that very afternoon I'd bought a chainsaw. My son and I were going to go out and clear brush. That very afternoon I looked out the window, it was dark, and then I looked out and saw fire trucks. So the very afternoon we bought the chainsaw was when the fire happened. So anyway, just think about it as far as fuel. I mean, we talked about some of the positive intent or the needs that even bad habits can fill. But I tell people to think about what it is you're really longing for. If you could wake up tomorrow morning and you had the life you wanted, what would that be? Sometimes that can help you kind of tune into what you really long for, what it would take for you to actually feel satisfied. We often get into bad habits or difficult or problematic things in life because we don't know what we really want. We're not pursuing what would really make us happy. I think it was C.S. Lewis who once said he thought a lot of affairs would be prevented if people just took up golf. Now, not everybody would love golf, but I mean, what he's saying is a lot of people live dreary, joyless lives, and then they go really off the deep end into a highly problematic behavior because somehow it would be irresponsible just to have some fun. Look for alternative ways to meet those needs. And one I draw from what Christ talked about. Jesus talked about the house and the 7 demons. He talks about how one demon gets swept out of the house and the house is empty. And when the house is empty, 7 worse demons come in to take advantage of the empty house. So I use that, what I call the crowd out versus throw out principle. And there's actually brain research behind this that basically says you cannot get rid of a bad habit. It is still wired in your brain somewhere. We can actually find it on a brain scan. What we do know, though, is that there's an area of your brain, the orbital frontal cortex, which actually can kind of wire in over that bad habit. But in order for the new pathway to be activated, you have to have something compelling and interesting and new to take the place of what you're getting rid of. If you simply decide, I'm not going to do this anymore, You know, no more dessert for me. Blue zone all the way. And you know, you're living a life of deprivation, you're eating food you hate, and you know, just all thinking about all the things you can't have and can't do and whatever. That's not going to work. Now, if you can find some ways to do blue zone happy, you know, that will work. But don't just try to throw things out. You know, crowd them out with things that are good. I'm going to come back to the pleasure principle. That's really crucial, what I'll be talking about. And human relationships, though, that's the pleasure the brain craves the most. You know, the best way to fill your brain with joy is good, positive relationships. Just go over this quickly. The difference between discipline and motivation. You know, motivation generates natural change. Discipline is when you're just trying hard, gritting your teeth. I'm going to work really hard on it. Motivation is where you have a clear, positive, compelling picture of what you want your life to be. And it's not because mom said it ought to be that way. You know, you all remember as a kids when you know, stay inside, work on your homework, don't watch TV, all the different things you were told. Motivation means you want it. It's not something you're doing for somebody else. But keys to motivation is first tap into things you already enjoy. You know, a lot of good, responsible people and people like chaplains and ministers and other good, responsible religious professionals are often so responsible that if I asked you, what do you really enjoy? You know, it's easy for those of us who are really responsible and faithful and spiritual and everything to forget what that is. But anyway, formulate a clear, compelling, attractive picture of what you want. And if it feels too grim and like medicine, what I call the cold oatmeal principle, then you know you're doing something wrong. Now I get this idea from when I was a kid, my mom always made oatmeal for breakfast, which, believe it or not, I actually like now that I'm an adult. I don't know what happened, but I hated it when I was a kid. And sometimes mom put dates in the oatmeal. That made it really bad. And she'd always tell me, if you don't finish it now, it will be waiting for you when you get home from school. And it was. You could turn the bowl upside down, it would just kind of stay in place like that. But if anything is feeling like that, you know you're doing it wrong. That doesn't work. Reward yourself, take baby steps. In other words, don't worry about the last step or getting all the way where you want to be. Just figure out what is the next step and just work on that. Here's an interesting one. Most of us have this idea, you know, if you're doing two things at once, you get more done. Guess what? You don't. When they've done brain scans of people who are multitasking, they discover that the brain energy is just kind of spilling out all over the place. You actually get less done when you're multitasking. Now, I'm not talking about, say, watching the TV while you're ironing or something like that. Or, you know, there are times when, you know, there's a certain kind of multitasking when you're just doing a routine task where, you know, listening to music or watching TV or something is fine. But too much multitasking actually drains brain energy. And what I encourage people to do is fully experience something in the moment. Don't split your brain. Now, one example I use of this, you know, when you wake up in the morning, you're telling yourself, I ought to get up. And so you're saying, no, but the bed feels so good. No, I ought to get up. Oh, no, but the bed feels so good. And your brain is kind of floating back and forth. For me, it's the shower. You know, I could stay in the shower until I turn into a raisin. You know, I mean, I could just, you know, turn on the water, get clean, get out. You know, I could just sit there and stand there and meditate for hours. You know, use up all our hot water and everything else. But what I tell people is find some way to be fully in the moment. You know, I'm going to lie here in bed for 5 minutes and just enjoy it. Then I'm going to get up. Or I'm just going to enjoy the feeling of that water, you know, and then I'm going to get out. Even with food, what we've discovered is that people who enjoy their food have a much easier time at the end of a meal getting up and leaving and stopping eating. So one of the best ways to deal with food issues is to learn to savor your food more. Enjoy it. That actually helps you more. Pay attention to the flow. I will talk about that more later. Some people actually do better with distractions like music. But I want to just highlight this whole pleasure principle, that every motivation for something that really works well is connected with the pleasure or reward system of your brain. That's what gives you the energy to make positive changes. You got to enjoy something. So you learn to focus best by finding things you really enjoy and learning to fully experience those things you really like. Pleasure changes and energizes the brain. What we notice about people who tend to binge on drugs or substances or processes that are problematic, whatever it is, that those are people who have a hard time just enjoying life. Stanton Peele, a leading addictionologist, says the ability to derive positive pleasure from life is the single biggest predictor of non-addiction. So we think about people who get into addictive patterns or do too much of whatever, and we say, well, you're just too pleasure-oriented. Probably not true, probably the opposite. So, learn to truly, fully savor experiences. That helps your brain and helps your brain do better. And the key is natural contextual or savored pleasure. I mean, even like with sugar, it's a part of food. Now, we have these gargantuan desserts that are solid sugar, but that's sugar taken out of its natural context. So the goal is to find pleasure in its natural God-given context and learn to really savor it and enjoy it. I remember my mother, she always had this idea that, sugar was bad. And there's some truth to that, but every once in a while she would bake a real cake. Now, most of the time our family desserts were something that felt sort of like sawdust glued together with apple juice. And we call those health food cookies. But sometimes my mother would make a real cake, but the whole time she's telling herself, I can't enjoy this, I can't enjoy it. And so she cut herself a slice about that big. And by the time the afternoon was over, she had eaten through 2/3 of the cake. And my dad used to say, Ruthie, just cut yourself a piece of cake and enjoy it. Well, she couldn't because it was sugar and she wasn't supposed to enjoy sugar. But the fact is, when you're not giving yourself permission to enjoy something, it becomes more of a problem. Now, another major principle on this is what we call oscillation. Oscillation means shifting gears. For example, if you're studying hard, study hard for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever works for you, and then give yourself a 5-minute pleasure break. Your brain is not designed to do anything just what we call in a linear fashion. Work hard, work hard, work hard. Work hard for a while and then give yourself a break. We call it, as I say, you shift gears. And that actually helps you become much more effective at peak performance. Oscillation, Jim Lohr, who works with Olympic athletes, he works with this with the athletes. This oscillation principle in training, very helpful. The shift point should be as clear as possible. And so something really pleasurable, then your hard work. Pleasure, hard work, so you're going back and forth. And, so your brain is experiencing different states of being. Studying hard, giving yourself a pleasure break. Devotional time in a busy day, and then Sabbath rest in a busy week. These are examples of oscillation. It isn't just about the day, it's also about the whole context. Sometimes fasting, anything you're too stuck on. For me, it's internet. I'm always checking my email. So fasting isn't always from food. Sometimes it's from, just things like, too much internet. So anything that's taking up too much shelf space in your life, oscillate. Get away from it sometimes. Don't do it all the time. Getting out in nature. Hug a tree, climb a mountain, pet a cat, ride a horse, climb a rock. Once again, oscillation, something different. Once again, it helps your brain and helps you change. Ritual. If you can get as many of the things you want down to a ritual, if you're trying to follow a certain devotional time practice, if you can find a regular time and place, in your marriage or your key relationships with your kids, kind of rituals, certain times. These are times for my family, times for my kids. And one of the nice things about date night is you have something predictable. It helps you kind of get into a ritual on it. Experiential states must be cultivated. So, don't overthink. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, a psychologist, talks a lot about flow, which is peak performance, which is getting yourself into kind of an optimal performance state. And he says, pay attention to those times when you're fully alive. When you're doing, you say, yes, this is what I was made to do. This is me. I am authentic at this moment. And pay attention to that. You know you're in the flow because you really don't have a strong sense of the passage of time. You're just fully alive, you're enjoying it, you're at an optimum level. You're not trying so hard you're exhausted or bored because it isn't challenging you. So one of the ways to understand the flow is just, pay attention. When am I in that kind of state? And whatever you're doing to get there, do more of it. And oscillation is one way to, to help with that. Social context, just a little bit about that. Time is just about up here, but I just want to say once again, pay attention to your own hopes and dreams. What would you want your life to be if you didn't have to worry about pleasing somebody else? That will at least tell you something about your core, what you need to tap into to get that energy to help your life go where you want it to be. It's a cartoon. Once again, I wasn't able to include it here, but it's a snow cone stand. And selling snow cones is a snowman. And the snowman has scoops all over. And so I use that to say, if you're giving up too much of yourself to do anything, be anything, whatever, it's not going to work. Don't give up yourself to meet somebody else's expectations or whatever it might be. Take advice when it helps, but know how to pick and choose. We already talked about people who want to run your life, they actually shut down your brain. So the control freaks are not doing you they're not doing you a favor. Your brain works more poorly in the presence of that. Just some things to think about with social support, people who make you feel good, people who are encouraging, who listen well, who are realistic, who will give you honest feedback and hold you accountable in ways that work for you. Notice nagging is not on the list. People who don't have a control agenda or have too much invested in the outcome. There's a Kathy cartoon I think of in this context. Kathy is coming into Irving and she's saying, "Thank heavens you're here. I had an awful time at the accountants." And Irving says to her, what happened? Let me fix it. Well, I don't want you to fix it. Just be here. Well, be here doing what? Be here being here. Be here being here doing what? Well, just be here doing nothing but being here. And finally he says, how do I know when I'm finished? Now some of that may be partly a man-woman thing. Men are always ready to rush in to fix things too quickly. But you need people who will be there for you, whatever that means. Okay, last thing, spiritual power and change. Just knowing you're not alone. God aspect is important. And as I say, there's actually brain research that shows regular practice of spirituality. Where you are praying, reading the Bible, focusing on maybe events from the life of Christ, whatever it might be that's part of your spiritual practice, we can actually see the brain change in as little as 11 weeks. But as I say, we also know that if you have a fearful, negative, angry view of God, it actually does brain damage. So it isn't just spending time with God, it depends on what kind of view of God you have and what type of God you're serving, how you envision God. The faith community, there's something very powerful about having your whole community support you, whatever it is you want to change, knowing you've got your faith community. The motivation we talked about earlier is, that there is something about that relationship with God that just gives you that motivation to change. Get insights from the Bible, and there are things that you can find that you would never find if you were simply on your own. Things you get from the life with God and the journey with God. Okay, I just want to close by talking about locking in change. One thing we know is that repetition is really key to locking in any kind of change. It isn't just if you have some great epiphany and something changes, you got to keep doing it. And practice, practice, practice. It doesn't settle into your brain without practice. We also know that vividness of associations with a new pattern helps you maintain the change. So it's even just the way you focus on it. You create really vivid mental pictures of the outcome you're aiming for, or the moments you're in the flow, or what your life looks like when you're achieving the goals that you have for yourself. Just that vivid mental picture, strong, powerful emotional associations that you cultivate when you think about that. That is actually very powerful in terms of actually locking in change. Finding ways to keep reminders fresh and active in your life. It can be recorded messages, something, a little prompt on your iPhone, written reminders, people who can remind you. And finally, just the idea that changes are maintained in the same way that you got into them, you started developing the new pattern in the first place. So going back to what we said earlier, change is inevitable except from a vending machine. But the fact is, change is possible if you respect the person God made you to be, the basic parameters of your life, and some of these brain research ways that actually can help nudge your life in some new dimensions, help you become more of what you want for your life. Okay, we've got a couple minutes for questions here. Anybody want to ask something before we wind this up?
What was the name of the doctor, the addiction specialist?
Stanton Peele, P-E-E-L-E.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Having been a pastor and an academician at the same time, when people say from the pulpit, God can change you, can change you, can change you, is it that it's just something that they say?
Well, yeah, I do believe that God can change lots of things, but here's an interesting example. Like, for example, spiritual gifts. Remember, one spiritual gifts talks about this huge contrast between natural talents and spiritual gifts. It talks about natural talents, which you were born with, spiritual gifts, something God gives you at conversion, and it made it sound like it had nothing to do with each other. And I don't believe that. I believe that God helps us develop along the paths that are congruent with the person we basically are to begin with. So that's one of the things just for starters. God will develop you as you. It's very rare that God makes you into some totally different person or gives you spiritual gifts that have nothing to do with your natural talents and abilities. But the other thing I would just say is all of these things are actually things that in some way involve God. God put the pleasure in the food, for example. God gave lots of ways in the Bible for oscillation. I mentioned oscillation was one of the key principles. Most of the examples you could come up with are actually things from the things from the Bible. The Bible is full of them. You know, Jesus was out with the crowds to go and invited the disciples to go rest a while. You know, there was that kind of oscillation. The Old Testament is filled with examples, not just Sabbath in the context of 6 days of work, but filled with examples of various ways that God put this oscillation principle in people's lives. Now, what I would say, though, is that God works through the principles He's given us. That I don't see frequent cases where, you just kind of have this Damascus Road thing, and God just zaps the change into your brain. I'm not saying it can't happen. I mean, God can do miracles. But I'm saying normally I'd say God works through all the different things that He's created as part of who we are. All of them are things that employ God's power to change us.